Welcome back to the We Who Thirst podcast, where Jesus is the living water and it is we who thirst. You can support this ministry by joining our Patreon. Our current series is Women in Context, a deep dive into the lives and stories of the women of the Bible in their cultural, familial, and historical context. Welcome back to the We Who Thirst podcast. I am so glad that you are here. One quick note before we get started, I have been recovering from being sick, so my voice may sound a little different today, but I thank you so much for listening and bearing with me in this process. With me today is my good friend, Elise Kilko. She is a foreign worker, volunteer, mother, and homemaker. And today we are going to be continuing our mini-series on Proverbs 31 to discover how God delights in women. Specifically, we'll be talking about the Proverbs 31 woman, the woman of valor, and her two separate businesses. Now, Elise, many in our audience have been taught one of the following, and let me know if any of these teachings are ones that you have heard or have impacted you personally. Many have been told a woman should not have a job outside the home and that having that kind of job would be sinful or borderline sinful if she couldn't verify a good enough reason. They may have been told a woman could have a side hustle as long as it never took away from her homemaking duties. Anything she does that is not homemaking related, she can only do after her homemaking has been adequately completed. Many have been taught that homemaking for a woman was the best, most holiest thing she could do, that it is God's will for her. And we've also been told in conjunction with all of this, on the kind of the opposite side, that it's the man's job to provide, not the woman's. Have any of these things impacted you?
Yes, absolutely. I think I have heard all of those things as teachings. Being from the Bible, which as we get into the text, we're going to have to reevaluate each one of those. And I'm excited to do that today. I think the ones that I probably heard the most was that homemaking is the best, holiest thing. Like you might do something else, but if you're not doing this, then there is probably something wrong. They wouldn't necessarily say it's sinful, but they're like, this is the holiest, most important thing. And anything else is less than. And then that it's the man's job to provide and the woman's job to support. I think would be the dichotomy that I was given.
And that man's job to provide thing, in every single complementarian book I pick up, and even complementarian people I talk to, the man providing comes up every single time. And these could be slightly softer complementarians. These could be the really hard patriarchalist complementarians. Wherever they're at in the spectrum, the idea that it's the man's job to provide, I think it's also a cultural norm here in America that the man has to be the provider. So you're dealing with both a cultural as well as a theological norm. But I think the episode today is going to shake that up a little bit. I'm really excited to talk about the verses in this passage that talk about the woman of valor's businesses, because they are full of insight. So I want to talk about kind of each of her businesses in turn. We'll start with her home, because I want to remind us that in the ancient world, the home was the economic center. So running her home was akin to running a business. Because of this, in the ancient world, there is no differentiation between the woman of valor's work inside the home and her work outside the home. So whereas I'm using business to describe her economic endeavors, they would not have considered them as businesses. We consider the home and business to be separate entities in our culture. In the woman of valor's culture, they don't consider those separate businesses. So I just want to acknowledge at the start of this episode that I'm using our language to describe something that they didn't necessarily view that way, if that makes sense, Elise.
Yes, that makes so much sense. And it's good that you make that differentiation, because I think that that'll help us understand the text a lot better as we look back to the historical context.
So she has business ventures, but they're also not like the stay-at-home mom's side hustle. I see that, she has a side hustle like other stay-at-home moms. That's not none of our economic structures fit what is going on in the text. So I just
Mm-hmm.
want to start with that we are dealing with something that doesn't fit the way our economy works today.
Mm-hmm.
But because today we would consider these things separate, I wanted to kind of discuss them separately because there's also a chronological order in her tackling these different economic ventures or
Sure.
businesses.
Okay.
So the first one is her textile export business. And this is the one the text talks about the most, and we have the most details. So, Elise, would you read Proverbs 31, verse 13, 18, 19, 21, 22, and 24?
All right, let's start with Proverbs 31:13. She selects wool and flax and works with willing hands. And then verses 18 and 19, she sees that her profits are good and her lamp never goes out at night. She extends her hands to the spinning staff and her hands hold the spindle. And then 21 and 22, right?
Mm-hmm.
She is not afraid for her household when it snows, for all of her household are doubly clothed. She makes her own bed coverings. Her clothing is fine linen and purple. And then 24, she makes and sells linen garments and delivers belts to the merchants. And that is in CSB.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yes. So you're calling this a business, but it wasn't like a factory, weaving and making clothing, typical normal women's work. Wasn't this like regular work? So you're saying it's regular work, but it wasn't a factory. Can you talk to us about that?
Yes, her weaving and making clothing here isn't exactly the same as the normal woman's work in the ancient world. There's overlap here because every woman was weaving and making clothes or things for her house. Every woman in the ancient world was engaged in this kind of activity. So we have to consider, how does the woman of valor's activity doing these things, how is that different than the average woman's activity? Why do I call this a business and not what they are doing?
So how does this differ then from the average peasant women's textile work? Why is this a business different than what the average Jane was doing?
I mean, the biggest, most obvious difference is that the woman of valor is selling her wares to merchants. So that's going to create a big difference. The average peasant woman isn't making textiles to sell. She is simply making enough to clothe her family. And that is all the time that is all she has time or resources to do. She is
Mhm.
scraping by to get another tunic made for her 5-year-old because he keeps outgrowing the last one, and that is all
Mm.
she has bandwidth for. But the woman of valor is making an excess of textiles to sell and then bring in income, whether coinage or goods, for her family.
Mhm.
So
And it even talks about the kind of textiles.
Mhm. Yes, and the average woman typically would make very simple garments from one type of material, often wool, that was usually grown by their own flocks. It's a very internalized process. So the husband and the kids would take care of the sheep, they would shear the sheep, the women and the daughters would then card the wool and spin the wool and weave the wool into clothes. And they're not going outside to get this wool. Usually, they are raising the sheep. They are sheep that, sheep to
Hmm.
garment. It's an internalized process to their own household. They're doing all of that.
Okay.
They would do this in conjunction with other women in their communities, so they can all sit around weaving and talking while they're doing this. They would bring,
Hmm.
you know, you would bring your wool and I would bring my wool and we'd sit together and
Sure.
spin. But we get our wool from our own sheep. Um, so it's an internalized process for most peasant homes. And they may have had some access to flax to make linen, but that was usually a higher level commodity and may not have been as regularly available as wool, because wool, you shear sheep on a regular schedule. And as long as your sheep is
Hmm.
alive, it's going to be producing wool. Whereas linen, you have to have the right ground, you have to have water, you have to have all of these things
Yeah.
flax to grow. And so it's a little more difficult to get a hold of than
Hmm.
wool.
That makes sense. So why is this a business and what do we see here?
What we see going on with a woman of valor in her business differs from the peasant woman, because whereas the peasant woman is getting wool from her own sheep to make clothes from her family, the woman of valor is purchasing the raw materials for her textile business. She's not growing the flax herself, and she's not shearing the sheep herself, or her husband
Hmm.
isn't shearing the sheep. The word select in the NIV, um, in verse 13, indicates to seek out or ask information about. So she is having to find sources for the raw materials for this business. So that already sets a different economic kind of presence that what she's doing has. She's
Hmm.
not using what her family has readily available because they produced it themselves. She's sourcing the raw goods of two different types, both wool and flax.
Hmm. Okay.
Um, she is doing the spinning and the weaving in-house. That's important, and we'll come back to that later on. She's doing the spinning and the weaving, but what the woman of valor is creating is not simple, like homespun garments for her family, though her family does wear some of what she makes. She is creating luxury goods. And the text is very clear that these are luxury goods she's creating, not your average wear. She is dealing in dyed fabrics, whether she's dyeing in-house or buying wool that is dyed. Linen does not carry dye well at all. That's why it's normally white. So she would be dealing in white linen, but she could be buying dyed wool already. She could be sending the wool she purchased out to have dyed. She could be dyeing it in house. We don't know how she's working the dyeing
Hmm.
process, but she's dealing in dyed fabrics, which a lot of peasants may not have time for dyeing. Sometimes they would
Hmm.
use plants or other things to dye. Sometimes they're just using undyed wool because they got to get this done. So she's dealing in dyed fabrics, and she's dealing in very finely woven and fancy linens, not a
Hmm.
rougher homespun woolen clothing, but very, very fine, intricate sorts of garments and textiles. She
And
also
the reference to her family being clothed in purple then would be showing that it's luxury because that was a
Mhm.
hard color to dye, right?
Yes. Yep. So in verse 21, when it talks about her family being clothed in scarlet, that word in Hebrew is of uncertain origin. It is also similar to the Hebrew word for two. So some people think it's the word for like red scarlet clothes. The other people think it's the word for like double clothed. Like they have two outfits, or they have extra clothes going on, because your average person in the ancient world only has one change of clothes. I have a closet full of 15 to 20 outfits, and that's normal in our consumeristic
Hmm.
society. But back then, you had one change of clothes, maybe two if you were doing well, three if you're really rich. So
Hmm.
the fact that her family is in dyed garments, or they have extra clothes, is showcasing the wealth that she's able to create from her handiwork.
Mm. That's interesting.
She's also creating a wide variety of projects, and every woman who needs to make different things for her family, like towels and bed linens and tunics and mantles. But the woman of valor is creating extra mantles in verse 21. She's creating bed coverings in 22. She's creating linen clothing. So you're dealing with both wool and linen. She's dealing with sashes, and the linen clothing and the sashes are part of what she's selling to the merchants.
Okay.
So, whereas a peasant woman would need to make many of these end products, the quality of the peasant woman's work wouldn't have been the same as the woman of valor. So, this business is multifaceted, dealing with multiple mediums for her end products, and it's dealing with luxury goods.
Mm. So what would be needed for the woman of valor to run a business like this? What all does that entail?
It would include she needs a lot of social connections. She needs connections with the producers of raw materials. She needs connections with the merchants, potentially with people who dye. There is no Etsy or Amazon for her to just like throw, I made a scarf. Who wants to buy? There's none of that. Like she has to have serious social connections to make this happen. And some of the words for merchants in these texts are talking about international merchants. They're not the guy from one village over who comes over to your village to sell his pots or whatever. You're talking about wandering traders who are going from place to place, and or even potentially ships that are coming into port. And so she has some serious connections with international merchants that she is working with to export her luxury textiles. The other things that are needed to run this sort of business that she is doing, that the text reveals to us, is a lot of wealth, skill, and some help. You have to have privilege to do what she is doing. This is not something the average peasant woman could accomplish.
Yeah. She would have to be important enough to be able to talk to the right people to get the sort of trade to be
Mm-hmm.
done. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's interesting.
And I really want to mention the wealth and the skill together because of everything that goes into creating fine linens or woolen garments. Elise, do you do any sort of like needlework, crochet, knitting, any of that?
I do not have the patience for it, but I deeply appreciate it. So I don't do it myself. I've tried to learn different things. I could maybe do some cross stitch if it were like about,
Two
two
by
by
two?
2 inches.
Yeah. Well,
um,
in the world of crocheting, knitting, all of that, and I'm going to try to make it as simple as possible because I'm sure we have some listeners who have no idea. There's different yarn weights. If you were to go to a store, and let's say your friend's crocheting, they're like, "Go buy me yarn." There's different yarn weights, and these weights have names, which can get really confusing. I'm going to go with the numbers. And so you have a number 1 yarn, which is really thin and tiny, and then you have a number 6 yarn, which is much thicker and fatter and chunkier. So if
mhm,
I'm making a throw blanket that is 40 inches by 60 inches, if I'm using number 1 yarn, which is really thin, it's going to take me 5 times as long to make that throw blanket as if I'm using the number 6 yarn, which is really thick, because the thicker
mhm.
yarn works up a lot faster. I mean, this kind of just makes sense. It's bigger, so it's
Yeah,
going to.
yeah. Mhm,
So when we're thinking about the woman of valor making fine fabrics, she is creating the thread or the yarn for these fabrics herself in-house. She is participating in this labor in order to take the raw wool or flax and twist it into a very fine string piece of yarn. That takes some serious skill. And it takes time because you have to make a lot of it. And then the time to weave that fine yarn into a fine fabric is going to take much longer than the time the average peasant woman might take on a regular homespun garment. So the fact that
mhm,
so this is showcasing the fact that she has the skill to create that fine of a product. That is serious talent and skill that she has, and that she's
mhm,
training others in her household to do. Um, but also she has enough wealth that she can take the time to create that kind of product, because she's not needing to get this done right now so that I can go help with the
mhm,
harvest. She has the time to spend excesses amount of time on making very, very fine clothing. So the fact that she has wealth and skill allows her to run this business that those in that culture without the same level of privilege as she has could not accomplish.
That's so interesting. That's a really interesting.
Because as we think about the saying time is money, um time was always of the essence for peasant family who's dealing in a sustenance agricultural context. They are simply trying to preserve food, get winter clothing made so they do not freeze. They're trying to make sure they can survive. They're not sitting around seeing how teeny tiny
Yeah.
they can spin this linen. Can I get it smaller? Let's see if I can get it small. They don't have time for that nonsense.
Yeah.
And it's not nonsense, but they don't have time. They have to get
Yeah.
it done.
So
What also
the time that the woman of valor would have invested in her business alone shows her privilege.
exactly. Yeah. Because your peasant woman may have the same level of skill, but if she doesn't have the time to invest in it, because her family needs her to help with the harvest and her family needs that winter wrap in 2 weeks because winter is coming, she doesn't have the time to invest in creating a dyed, finely woven purple bedspread.
Hmm.
They need something warm and they need it now, and we're doing it. So the time and the fact that the woman of valor has help to do this that can cut down on some of the time. But in a peasant household, everybody's going to be working together, but on similar projects for, again, survival. You don't have
Hmm.
several people in a wealthy environment who can all spend their day working on a fine linen bedspread. In a peasant home, you have people who are working on getting this coat done because winter is coming. And so the privilege of time and skill and help really come to play with her business here.
That's so interesting. What else would she have needed to run a business like this?
She would have needed business savvy. She has to not only be skilled in creating these luxury textiles, she needs to have enough business savvy to deal with the merchants, to haggle, to maintain those relationships with throughout the haggling process, to get the good deals on the raw materials, to sell her wares at a price that they are worth. So she needs business savvy. She's smart. She knows how to do this. She can run the finances. She can deal with the complex social relationships needed. She has to have access. And her husband, potentially being a king or very high nobility, could have given her a lot of this access. And she also just needed a superior product because why should they take your sashes
Hmm.
to
Yeah,
another country? Why not Fred's down the street?
somebody
So
else's.
there's
Yeah.
all of those things that go into this business.
What other things would you say are significant then about her textile business?
I think one thing that this passage shows that I really love, and it's back in verse 13, it says, she selects wool and flax and she works with eager hands. Her palms work with delight, is how you could translate the Hebrew there. She is excited about this work. She is passionate about this work, and she's hands on in the process.
That's so cool. It shows that she really loved what she was doing, or she was at least interested in it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So how do we know that this is a passion of hers? How would you prove that from the text?
That's a really good question because I've heard this verse used a lot, especially when it's Proverbs 31 is taught as a checklist. And
Hmm.
it's used to say, oh, look, the Proverbs 31 woman chooses to be excited about her homemaking. She's choosing a good attitude. Since she works with eager hands, you should work with eager hands. Um, and can we make good choices to be excited about whatever work God hands us? Absolutely. But one of the ways we know this is a passion of hers and not just a she chooses a good attitude about mundane things is that doing this work is beneath her station.
That's really interesting.
She doesn't have to do this. She
Hmm.
is the
The queen.
matriarch of a very wealthy household. She has servants for this. She doesn't have to. She wants to. She is passionate about it. She likes this. We also can tell because they devoted like 5 or 6 verses to talking about her business. 6 verses are talking about her textile endeavors. And yes, that is kind of women's work, but as we've talked, this she's not doing what the average woman does. She has made this into something truly spectacular, and she's following her passions. It is something that excites her. Her palms work with delight. She participates in the labor, even though it's beneath her station. She could be doing other things, but she chooses to do this.
That's so cool. I love that note.
Yeah, she's choosing to focus on what she's good at because we talked about skill. She's good at this,
Hmm.
and she's choosing to focus on what she's good at and what she's passionate about, where she has talent. There's lots of household activities in the ancient world that this passage doesn't describe her being involved with at all.
Hmm.
But that which she is skilled enough and passionate enough to be very successful at, that is what Proverbs 31 focuses on.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think it talks about food. It doesn't talk about her like making food or drawing water or
No, it doesn't. I mean, it says she brings in her bread, um,
yeah.
and she provides portions for her family. So she brings her food from afar. So she's like queen of takeout because the average peasant woman not only is spinning and weaving, she's also grinding grain for 2 to 4 hours a day.
Which is
And
crazy.
we never
It's
see the
crazy
woman
to
of
think about.
valor participating in food preparation at all. She brings her
Hmm.
food in, she brings her bread in, lechem, the Hebrew word for
Hmm.
bread, which is the main thing that the peasant woman is creating at home every day. The
Hmm.
woman of valor outsources that labor. She gets it from somewhere else. She brings her bread in from afar. She gives portions to her maidservants. And that's not the picture of like her necessarily standing over the stove like here's your soup.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
It. This is more of the storeroom manager rationing out the large storeroom that works for the house.
Hmm.
Um
And
it could
that's certainly
even
different
it could even be
from,
like you need to go grind grain for bread. You need to deal with the fatted calf. She it could be
mm,
assigning these maidens parts of the food preparation, but we never see the woman of valor actually hands-on doing food preparation um anywhere in Proverbs
that's
30.
such an interesting contrast. I mean, as far as how it talks about her weaving, I mean, it definitely shows that it's a passion, which is really cool.
Yeah, absolutely.
So sometimes it seems like the stay at home trad wife culture teaches that the woman has to be good and passionate about everything. Um, have you ever felt like that? How did that go down in your growing up years and as an adult?
Definitely. Like especially when you're taught especially when you come from circles where you're taught God created you as a woman to be a stay-at-home mom, and you're supposed to do it with eager hands. So if you don't like it, you better start liking it. You better get passionate about it. And authors like Rebecca Merkel in her book Even Exile, she goes on and on about how you have to find something in homemaking that you're passionate about if you want to honor God. That could be baking, it could be sewing clothes for your kids, it could be creating elaborate meals, it could be decorating, but you have to find something homemaking involved, not side hustle, not business,
Hmm.
not career. You have to find something traditional homemaking to become passionate about. Even if you're not passionate about everything, you have to be passionate about some homemaking pursuit. There's no
That's so that's so shame inducing. I mean, I definitely um like growing up, I definitely remember my mom like teaching us to clean house and teaching us how to be hospitable and teaching us how to make food. Although for me personally, my older sister is the one that taught me how to cook, not really my mom. But just like I don't remember growing up under the pressure of you have to be good at everything. But I definitely saw this like this poison being taught when I went to college and was kind of
Mhm.
in the fundamentalist adjacent things. As
Mhm.
in like growing up, there were two of us girls that loved being in the kitchen more, and there were two of us girls that liked cleaning more. And so, like on Saturdays, when we had the weekends, my sister and I would work more on the kitchen, and my other two sisters would work more on the cleaning. So we were allowed to, do what
Mhm.
we did best. And that's not to say that we were never taught to like switch, but we were
Right, right.
allowed to choose our passions. So yeah, that's interesting.
And when I went to seminary, because Dorothy Patterson was the president's wife during the time I was at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, she had a huge homemaking push because she felt that Dorothy Patterson, especially if you listen to other episodes, I've read quotes from her, but she believes a woman is in sin if she's not being a homemaker. And she believed that women are often not trained to be homemakers. So she was trying to get this homemaking education into the seminary. And they even had what they called the Horner homemaking house with a giant kitchen, and women could go to learn to do all of the domestic homemaking things there. And there's this huge push that this is a woman's calling from God to do all this homemaking stuff, which felt really weird because I'm like, I'm here to learn Hebrew and Greek.
Hmm.
I'm not here to learn how to bake a
Hmm.
pie. My womanhood class in college told me I had to bake a pie. I've already been here, done
Yeah.
that. I'm
And
here.
that's not to say that there isn't worth in learning how to do all those
Oh, I'm
things,
glad I know how to do
but
them. But there's a difference in being taught how to do a skill and being told it is God's will for your life that you have to know these skills.
yes, that is a very big difference for
Like
sure.
homemaking skills are good for every single human to know.
Yes.
Everyone should know how to sew on a button and make basic food. But to be
Yeah.
told it is God's will for your life because you have certain internal organs to that's where things get really shame inducing,
Hmm.
especially for women who their passions and what they're good at lie outside the frame of the normal activities.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes so much sense.
Homemaking culture focuses very much on cooking, cleaning, and childcare. Those are kind of the three big C's that my experience of homemaking culture really emphasize. Would you say those are probably three of the main areas complementary
Yeah.
and homemaking culture
Yeah, I would
emphasizes?
agree with that. I would agree with that.
And what I find fascinating about Proverbs 31 is you never see her in this passage do any of those. We never see her cook herself. We never
Uh-huh.
see her clean anything. And we don't see
Uh-huh.
her do a lick of childcare in the entire passage. The
Yeah.
three big C's that evangelical complementarian homemaking culture emphasizes to the nth degree, to the point that seminaries are putting in entire buildings to teach women to do these things. And then they hold up Proverbs 31 as a standard for homemaking. She doesn't actually do any of those things in that passage. What she does do is focus on her passions and make significant money by making it really finely crafted and well done.
That's so interesting.
I really want to focus for those who are listening here, especially those who are coming out of that evangelical complementarian culture, that the woman of valor focusing on the area she is passionate about and excelling in an area she is passionate about is celebrated in this passage. Even though that means she isn't doing other sorts of labor for her family. We don't see her doing cleaning or cooking. Is she running her household and making sure everybody has what they need? Absolutely. But we don't see her doing it. And when you come out of the complementarian culture where you, as the stay at home mom, have to do it all because God created you to do all the cleaning, do all the cooking, do all the things, the Proverbs 31 woman gets takeout. The Proverbs 31 woman outsources the cooking. The Proverbs 31 woman focuses on her skills and her passions for the benefit of her family. She's not ignoring them or not
Hmm.
ministering to them, but she doesn't have to do everything.
And that's such an important note to note that, you know, to take that to our day to day, we don't have to be good at everything. We can be passable on some areas and really great in others.
Yeah.
Should we be taking good care of our homes? Yes, absolutely. But we don't have to be excellent in every single area.
And it's not all on us. The three
Hmm.
C's in scripture are never just the woman's job.
That's
Every
true too.
human in our household, if they're old enough, every adult in our household, let me just say it that way. Every adult in our household is responsible for the three C's: cooking, cleaning, childcare. We
Hmm.
may negotiate with the adults in our household that one person does more of this, one person does more of that because of skill, time, etc. But
Hmm.
everyone is responsible to know these things and to help out. It's not just woman's labor. Because the woman of valor was so skillful and was so successful at making money with her passions, she's better able to increase her business ventures. Elise, would you read verse 18 for us?
Yes. Verse 18 says, "She sees that her profits are good and her lamp never goes out at night."
Actually, let me back up. I want to lead into that differently. So we see that the Proverbs 31 woman has been extremely successful in her export textile business. Elise, will you read verse 18 for us?
Proverbs 31, verse 18 says, "She sees that her profits are good and her lamp never goes out at night."
Now, Elise, the second half of this verse, her lamp does not go out at night. What have you heard this means?
I always heard it when we read this verse and like we're trying to figure out what it means. A lot of times people would bring up the parable of the 10 virgins waiting for the
Okay.
bridegroom,
Hmm.
with some of them had oil, some of them didn't, and
Good.
how
Yeah.
it was did they squander their oil or did they, have enough? Um, so that was always kind of talked about it in conjunction. So it wasn't always necessarily said that like she was rich and you can see because her lamp went out the whole night, but it was more like maybe a planning thing. Like she
Mm,
planned well
you played
because
ahead.
she planned
Yeah.
ahead.
Yeah. I've usually heard this verse, and when I was doing research, I saw this in blogs as well. People take this verse that her lamp does not go out at night and that she rises early to give portions to her maidens. They take those verses as this woman works all the time. She's up
That's
late
dangerous.
working. Yeah. And we're going to do a whole episode on her resting. So I'm not going to camp out here long. But typically, these verses are interpreted as she works all the time. She gets up early and she's working. She's up working
And she
late at
stays
night.
up late.
Yeah. But when you look at verse 18 and then you take into consideration the Hebraic parallelism that's going on in the Hebrew poetry, it says that she sees that her trading is profitable. The point of the first half of the verse is the profit from her trading. And then her lamp does not go out at night. There are ancient proverbs that only a poor person's lamp goes out at night.
Oh, interesting.
So this is yes, planning, because light is in a woman's domain. She has control of light for the household. But it is a cultural way of saying she she can
She's
pay for the
privileged
family.
enough.
She's produced enough to make sure her lamps don't go out. Y'all's lamps might go out because you're poor.
Mhm.
Her lamp does not because she's rich. The lamps at night are a sign of wealth. Sleeping in darkness is a sign that you're poor.
Why would they burn lamps at night?
I get this
In
question.
historical context.
Yeah, I get this question all the time because we turn off all our lights at night. We want to sleep in the dark. But we are also not superstitious people like the ancient people were. They were afraid of spirits and things that go bump in the night. So they would often light lamps as a safety precaution against those sorts of things. And it also helps you can see if you need to get up with a child because you can't just flip on a light switch.
Mhm.
But I think the big reason was to protect the family from spirits or beings they believed could be around to hurt people in the dark at nighttime. So that's part of the significance. She's able to protect her family because she has made money to keep lamps burning, and she's able to plan ahead how much oil is needed and manage this aspect well.
Okay, that's so interesting. Now, you said that there were two businesses mentioned
Mhm.
here. What is the second one?
The second one, the text does not spend nearly as much time on. Um, but there's a lot in this one little verse in the context that we don't necessarily think through. So Elise, her second business is a vineyard and winery. So Elise, would you read verse 16?
Okay, it says, she evaluates a field and buys it. She plants a vineyard with her earnings.
So once again, we see that the woman of valor is doing things outside the usual scope of her gender. And if you want to hear more about her acting outside the usual scope of her gender, go read the full discussion or listen to the full. You can either read the transcript or listen to the full episode of episode 7 of my podcast where we talk about that in detail. But we see her here. She is buying land and creating a new business. And
Mm.
again, her husband, who's at the city gates, is likely leveraging his position to help her with her business goals. Some people
Um,
argue, and I just saw this comment on a reel, somebody else's reel yesterday. People immediately look at this verse and argue that women couldn't own land in the Old Testament. So therefore, she must be just, her husband must have bought the land. She didn't really buy it. It was somebody else. And they denigrate this for her. But Elise, who else do you remember in the Old Testament that owned land?
well, Rahab owned a house.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Naomi was getting her land back when Boaz married Ruth. And then the daughters of Zelophehad inherited their land from their father. They went to Moses and spoke, since they had no brothers, they asked for their own inheritance. Did I get the ones you were thinking of?
Yes. And so, though it's not normal for women to own land in the Old Testament, it does happen. So, her
Uh-huh.
owning land is not outside the realm of possibility, especially when you're dealing with potentially a very privileged aristocratic woman or a queen. Normal rules don't always apply to them.
Mhm.
It's also possible that Proverbs 31 could have been a later addition to the book of Proverbs during the Persian age after the return. And during the Persian age, women owning land and businesses was a lot more common than previously until the Greeks took over, but that's a discussion for another time.
Oh, the Greeks.
Oh, the Greeks, ruining it for women constantly. So there's a lot in verse 16 that the original hearer of this verse would understand what's happening, but we miss. Elise, what are some of the things you can think of from other passages of scriptures that go into having or creating a vineyard?
So you have to have the vines, and in a lot of passages it talks about having a wall around the
Okay.
vineyard
Okay. What
to
else?
protect it. Um, I don't know what else. Land. I mean, you have to have the
Land.
land.
The
You
land.
have to have the
Yeah.
land, you have to have the vine.
So there's
And a
lots
lot
of
of times.
things involved here. There's walls. Almost every passage that talks about vineyards talks about walls, especially in the New Testament. Sometimes there's towers. You have to have trellises for the grapevines. I don't know what they were always made of. Now they're made out of wood, which was kind of expensive back then. Now wood's much cheaper, but back then wood was much more expensive. You have to have, again, the seeds for the vines. You have to have time to wait for the grapevines to develop, and you
Mhm.
have to have access to a wine press. So She buys a field. This could be a terraced field that was previously used for a different sort of crop. It could just be a plain piece of ground. We're not sure what kind of field it is that she's buying. The Hebrew word here is very general. It could be like the plains way out there, or it could be like wheat field. We don't know. But
Hmm.
she buys some land. And so, in order to plant a vineyard, she has to likely get a wall built, perhaps a tower, and trellises for the vines to grow on. So this is
That's a lot.
a lot of labor. Um, is she doing this labor or is she hiring it out? What do we think?
I'm guessing she's not the one rolling up her sleeves and doing it. As a queen, she's definitely not the one doing it. I think she's probably in a managerial role, making sure things are getting done. But
Yes. I would agree, especially since she's passionate about her textile business.
hmm.
I can't imagine her if they're going on simultaneously, which they may not be. But I imagine if they were going on simultaneously, she's going to want to spend the bulk of her time there. So she's much more in a managerial role of this vineyard. Um, which brings up, so who is her hired labor, which means it's likely peasant men in the community that she's hiring to do all of these things for her. Which gets really interesting when you think about how hard complementarians say women shouldn't ever be the boss of men.
Yippee.
So, like John Piper has specific guidelines that a woman should never be, these are his words, never be personally directive towards a man, like giving them driving directions. A woman could be non-personally directive, meaning she wrote a book that the man read, or she wrote the map that the man needs to find his directions, or maybe she's the city planner who made all the streets so he can only drive on the street. So she's kind of directing him because that's where the street is, but that's non-personal because she's not like face to face with him. So a woman who's face to face with a man cannot tell him what to do, per John Piper and hard complementarians of his ilk.
There's absolutely no way the woman of valor is following this rule by John Piper. Like, there just is not. Like,
She didn't hear his sermon on this, did
she
she?
didn't she didn't get the memo.
No. No, she is. I doubt she's being the foreman for the work crew, but she is at least giving directions to the foreman or the contractor, like, here's where I want the wall, here's what you need to do. And she's financing it. So she has a directive role in this way.
At the very least, it's a conversation.
At the very
Like, I bought this land, where's the best place for the wall? Like, it's
right.
at the very least, it's a conversation.
Yes. Yes. And then because it's a vineyard, she needs to use her social skills to negotiate time at the community wine press. Or it doesn't say this, but potentially as a queen, I could see her building a wine press for her community, which is then benefiting the entire community, not just herself. So she's
Hmm.
providing jobs for her community. She's potentially providing resources. This wine she might be selling back to her community or selling to merchants. We don't know the end result of this
Hmm.
vineyard, but this could be a big payoff for her community at large.
That's so interesting. Yeah, because a lot of villages in Israel, archaeologically from this time period, had both a wine press and a
Threshing floor?
milling threshing floor for community
Yes.
use.
They generally had one for the village or the community that was shared. And
Hmm.
typically the men were in charge of figuring out who got to use the threshing floor, the wine press, like which family got to use it first and
Hmm.
all of that. So now she's the one managing a vineyard. She's again stepping into these kind of masculine spaces to figure out the how the produce from her vineyard, or she's hiring a man to do that for her, but she's still kind of stepping into these sorts of areas that were typically male run.
Hmm. So let's clear things up. Is the Proverbs 31 woman supposed to be a stay-at-home mom? or should she be working outside the home according to Proverbs 31? What is the woman of valor supposed to be doing?
Actually, this passage isn't indicating either way. Um, Firstly, because the whole categories of working outside the home or being a stay-at-home mom didn't even exist in the Old Testament. So we're
Super
importing
important to
modern
note.
categories to a text that's not even familiar with those concepts. But secondly, these verses aren't saying one thing about what tasks a woman should do or where she should be performing the tasks. This passage is showcasing how one woman or a type of woman brought honor to her family and God through hard work and creativity in her particular culture.
That's
So
so good.
it's an example of, hey, a typological woman or a real woman back in the Old Testament used her creativity in this way. And God delights in women who use their creativity to benefit their families and communities and follow their passions, which He gave them, and their
Mm-hmm.
skills, which God gave them.
Mm-hmm.
God likes this. This is the type
That's
of
amazing.
who is to be praised. God likes it when women use their passions and their skills to benefit their families and communities, even when they don't do all the other mundane work.
That's so important. Jessica, it's my favorite time. What can we learn about God's heart for women from this passage?
God delights in strong, creative women. God delights when women work hard for the good of herself, her family, and her community. Um, God delights when a woman following God delights when women follow their passions, even when that means they outsource or reconfigure normal household dynamics in a way that helps her family thrive. The
Mhm.
Proverbs 31 woman's doing all sorts of things that are not normal in that culture. And God says, that's cool. Look at her. She's super creative. She figured out how to make this export textile business by buying bread for her family rather than grinding, because she's not spending time grinding grain, so she can spend time making really, really, really fine linen. She made a trade-off there. That's cool. Look at her being
Mhm.
smart. I like that. God gets excited about women using their wisdom and intelligence to find creative ways to bless their family while following the passions and skills that He gave them. It's
That's
not the
so
case where
important.
God's like, I desire all women to be homemakers, and if you are not passionate and skilled in that area, you just better buck up to choose to like it and learn the skills. God's okay saying, okay. I mean, we all need to be investing in our homes, men, women, children. That's beside the point. That's just basics. But if you're not passionate about being a stay-at-home mom, but you're passionate about speech therapy, go be a speech therapist and love on little babies who need to learn how to talk,
Hmm. Hmm.
or stroke victims, or whoever. Like what
Yeah.
you're passionate about, God delights in women following the passions and skills He gave them to benefit their families and communities in creative, novel ways.
Yeah, the division of labor that you see in Proverbs 31 between her and her husband for the historical context is very different than the norm from that time, which gives us freedom then in our time to reevaluate the division of labor between spouses in this day and age to say, who does each task best, and it might be a forever thing or it might be a season of life thing, which is
Yeah.
really interesting too.
Yeah.
What else can we learn about God's heart for women from this passage?
God is not afraid of women making money.
Amen.
God is not looking for women to be financially dependent upon a man. The man does not have to be the sole provider for the family. Her
Full
husband
stop.
probably was doing some sort of economic work on his own. The passage isn't talking about him, but she's doing quite well for herself and her family.
Mhm.
Her husband's not giving her the wool and the flax from his shepherding endeavors. Of course, he's probably a
Mhm.
lord or a king, not a shepherd, but that's beside the point. He's not producing the raw materials like a peasant husband would to give the raw materials to his wife that then transforms it into a coat.
Sure.
He's doing his economic things while she's doing her economic things, and they're working together, but neither of them are the what we would consider traditional breadwinner for the family. Provision was everybody's job. Young, old, male, female, everybody in the ancient economy is responsible for provision. So God is not looking for women to be financially dependent upon men. A woman making money, God is cool with that. He likes that.
Mm.
And God is not worried about women being appropriately directive to men. She had the means, the job, the necessity to be directive to the men helping her with the vineyard. I heard one hard complementarian blogger, I read her article on this. I think it was The Transformed Wife. And she was like, it must have been teenage girls who were helping her make the vineyard, because it couldn't have been adult women, because they would have been being keepers of the home like the Proverbs 31 woman. And it couldn't have been men, because she couldn't be the boss of men. So she probably had teenage girls helping her with the vineyard. But when you think
Probably not.
Probably not. No. When you think about who's doing the manual labor of making walls, no, that's teenage girls are not who's making walls in the ancient world. That is what the men in that culture did, is they made terraced fields and walls for vineyard. So God is not worried about women being appropriately directive to men. If God was truly worried about women being appropriately feminine by not being directive to men, he wouldn't have praised Deborah, Jael, the woman of valor, and Mary Magdalene in the Bible.
That's such an important note. Those were all very strong women.
We can talk later about the husband-wife submission passages in the New Testament, and I think we'll do a podcast on that at some point. But when we look at how Old Testament family structures work, the Old Testament family structures do not match complementarian family hierarchy ideals. And I think that if God really wanted complementarian style hierarchy to be central to the godly family, he would have put some of those hierarchical commands in the Old Testament, not just the New Testament, which was written under the misogynistic Greco-Roman philosophical system.
And we're back to those Greeks again.
Instead, we have the Proverbs 31 woman who is constantly walking in male spaces, doing typically masculine activities, being directive towards men, and earning significant amount of money, doing things that were not your typical day-to-day for women, mostly because she had the privilege, wealth, and means to not have to do the typical day-to-day things for women.
That's really good.
So the big thing I would just love our audience to take away from this episode is that God delights in women being who he created them to be. And yes, sometimes that means we sacrifice for our families and we do something we do a job that we don't love. We do activities we don't like the most for the good of our families and communities. That happens. But as we are able, God also delights in women following the skills he gave them and the passions he gave them to do life in creative ways to bless their families and communities, even when it doesn't look like the norm.
I love that.
God likes
so
that.
Encouraging.
And that's what I want to leave all of you listeners with, whether you're male or female. God delights in his people using the wisdom, passions, and skills he gives us to find creative ways to do life and bless other people. Thank you so much, Elise, for your time. Thank you all for tuning in and listening. May the Lord bless you and keep you, make his face shine upon you, and give you peace. Have a great day. Thank you for listening to the We Who Thirst podcast. A complete bibliography of the research behind this episode is available at wewhothirst.com. If you would like the full show notes, an opportunity to discuss each episode in a safe Discord chat, or simply to support this ministry, visit our Patreon. I am so thankful and honored to have had you here with me for this episode. Until next time, remember, Jesus is the living water, and it is we who thirst.